What we're going to be doing today, after some logistical details, is exploring our roots beyond Judaism. That is, looking at general humanist philosophy and the broader trends of humanism and human culture that have also contributed to our worldview, the way we celebrate life, the way we approach big questions, and the way we've organized our communities. And then we'll also talk specifically about the history of our movement, so that you can get straight what the difference is between the SHJ, the IISHJ, the IFSHJ, the LCSHJ, and all of the other various organizations you may see referenced from time to time. I'm thrilled to have leadership students here, but also thrilled to have adult learners here. And part of the Institute's mission has been to provide education not only for professional training, but also for lay people who are looking to learn and deepen their knowledge and experience. So I'm glad to have all of you here, and thank you to Ormet for making the seminar possible. Yesterday, we covered a lot of material. Hopefully you were able to sleep on it a little bit. Maybe some questions or comments percolated to the surface, and we'll take a few minutes to address those in just a moment. But we talked about a lot of things that really helped us set the table for today. We covered the concept of cultural and intellectual evolution, the idea that our distant ancestors may look very different from the way we are today, but we can see certain features that will be carried through and emphasized in later generations that are closer to who we are, and also to understand the difference between a precursor who sort of pops up episodically and a real ancestor that has some kind of genetic or mimetic connection from one generation to the other, and then a more immediate root who's closer to who we are, not identical, of course, but might recognize some of what we do as similar to what they did. We also talked about the traditional Jewish life and the medieval Jewish experience and how those communal experiences in history have impacted our own sense of Jewish identity and community. We talked about the Enlightenment, the process of Haskalah in Jewish life, and also the changes wrought by emancipation and integration to the surrounding societies. One of the reasons we spent time on the medieval period was to see how much things had changed from then to now, and how that change affected the worldview of Jews and ultimately who we are as modern Jews, or postmodern Jews, depending on your perspective. We also talked about the Reform movement and how that was one response to modernity in trying to balance what it means to be Jewish and a citizen. Their approach was be a man in the street and a Jew in your tent, that idea of keeping your Judaism as a private religious identity as opposed to a public ethnic identity. And then the other reaction, which we talked about in the afternoon, was the opposite direction. Instead of Judaism as a religious identity, it was Jewishness as an ethnic identity, specifically focused either around a political agenda of socialism or a cultural agenda around a language like Yiddishism, or even a combination cultural political agenda around Jewish sovereignty based in Hebrew and based in the land of Israel, which we call today Zionism. And finally, we talked in some detail about the balancing act of what we call the Cosmopolitans, the people who are of Jewish origin, who maintain some kind of Jewish connection, but who are more well known for their contributions to world culture. And some of them even might have chosen to go beyond the boundaries of Jewish identity. Even as we may claim them and their Jewish origins, they might not have claimed themselves as part of the Jewish people. We talked about the dividing lines between the universal in particular that they straddle. We'll talk more about that later this morning to early afternoon. So with that quick review, I wanted to ask if there were any questions or comments or reactions to some of the material that we covered yesterday. Again, I appreciate it was a lot of material and often covered relatively fast. I apologize for that, but I also don't apologize for that because I give as much information as we can feasibly cover, and hopefully some of it sticks. That's my approach to learning. So I wanted to ask if you had any questions or comments on the topics we covered previously. Yes?
It occurs to me as you were summarizing it, in the United States, a nation of immigrants, everybody has or has attached to them an ethnic identity. So if you were a Jew and you wanted to cross over the line and pose as an Anglo-Saxon and so on, you couldn't just stop being Jewish, you had to pretend to be something else. And I've known people who've made that transition.
Sure. In the African American experience, it was called passing. Or if you were light-skinned enough, you could move away and try to pass as white. Of course, you had to cut off all ties to your family. And there were also a lot of cultural dislocations involved in that. One of the interesting experiences for Jews, there's a great line by Horace Kallen, who was a preeminent Jewish sociologist in the early 20th century. He said something like, men can change their wives, their names, their professions, their residence. They cannot change their grandfathers. That there's something in how you were raised and who you are before you had a choice of who you are that still abides in your sense of self. Now you can choose to de-emphasize that and focus on liberation and freedom and autonomy and your own self-chosen identity, and people have certainly chosen to do that. But it also depends on what era in which you're working. In some ways, the Yiddish socialists were ahead of their time because they were trying to emphasize a multicultural America. They didn't see any conflict between their Americanness and their secular Jewishness ethnic identity. But in the early 20th century, the 1910s and 20s, hyphenated American was not a very popular category. That is, the thought was we're all just American. Turned out to be mostly WASP. But WASPs didn't have a self-consciousness as an ethnic group at the time. They defined themselves as simply American. And so the goal was to just be American and not to be a hyphenated American, a Jewish American, Italian. The goal was become American. It really wasn't until the 50s and 60s, more appropriately the 60s, that this multicultural moment and a sense of a multifaceted identity became more accepted in American society. So think of the dominant metaphor for America for a long time was the melting pot. Right. What happens in the melting pot? You put all these different materials in and they melt into one new alloy. Right. The model that's more often presented in a multicultural setting is like a vegetable stew, where you've got a lot of different elements, and they drop into the soup, and they each contribute something to the flavor of the whole, but still maintain their own identity. And the longer they're in the soup, sometimes the more porous the boundaries become, the softer those particular ingredients are, and they may eventually dissolve entirely into the soup. And there are some identities that are, less contributing to the whole, but also maintain their integrity. So if you drop an Amish rock into the soup, it's not going to add a lot to the whole, but it's also not going to change very much. And so the question becomes, is Jewish identity a rock, as in the ultra-Orthodox versions? Is it a carrot that'll last longer, or is it a tomato that's going to break down and contribute a lot to the soup, but also not maintain its integrity as long? So that's more of the multicultural model that's been more popular in the last 50 years. But in the first half of the 20th century, when Yiddish socialism was arguing for a multicultural version of identity, it was the melting pot. It was melt in and lose some of that distinctiveness. And that's why, by the way, in a lot of settings, the only vehicle for maintaining a distinct identity was a religious structure. So you would have Irish Catholic parishes and German Catholic parishes and the Lutheran Church, but the Norwegian Lutheran Church separate from the Swedish Lutheran Church. Right. And so religion became a proxy for ethnic identity. And that's why Reform Judaism worked for a lot of people. Even conservative Judaism worked as a structural religious framework, even though they were actually doing it for ethnic identity reasons.
There was another dynamic too, where some families wanted to only speak English and wanted to be American, and they denied their children the passing on of the heritage. And others tried to retain, while becoming Americans outside the tent, so as you say, they tried to pass that on to their children.
And the third version used Yiddish as a secret language. Yeah. So they would, if they wanted to talk in a way the kids couldn't understand, they would talk in Yiddish. So, of course, the result of that is they're not passing on Yiddish to the kids. Right. Because they don't want them to know what it means. But if they wanted them to know what it means, then so there's sort of three groups. There's the deny it, reject it. There's the accept it and try to further it. And there's the, here's the reality, the kids don't need it, but we use it for ourselves.
I still haven't forgiven my parents.
Yeah. I will tell you a joke based on this dynamic. There's a Jewish woman who decides she wants to join a Gentile country club, so she goes through the process of hiding who she is. And then one day she's out on the lake attached to the country club in a canoe, and the canoe tips over and she gets all wet and she says, "Oi gewalt," whatever that means.
Can I tell one?
Sure.
A guy goes through he dresses up in a three-piece suit and a vest, and he loses his Eastern European accent, and he's accepted at the country club, except for one last question. And they say, what is your religion? He says, we're Goyim.
Okay, other questions, please, Seth.
I don't know why this came to me, but I was wondering about military prominence and being hawks versus doves. We talked a lot about sort of peacemaking, touched on military might in the Maccabee era, and then zoom all the way forward to Zionist and the stronger, younger. Where did that
well, in general, Jews
building up come from?
Yeah, well,
other than the Holocaust.
In general, Jews didn't have military power. They were a subordinate minority, in many cases legally disarmed. So if you read, and this is talked about a bit in the Jew and the Muslim World, which were out of copies but still around ebook and elsewhere, in something called the Pact of Umar, which was basically delineating what were the criteria for subordinate minorities like Christians or Jews to live under Islam. They had to pay certain taxes. They couldn't build their synagogues or churches too high. They couldn't blow their shofars or ring their church bells too loudly. But one of them was they had to be disarmed. And so the idea of Jews fighting back was in fact illegal for a long period of time in the Muslim world. And the same was true, of course, in the Christian world, where you're vastly outnumbered by the surrounding population. Your strategy for survival is much more often acquiescence, accommodation, bribing, negotiating, rather than direct fighting back. Where that really begins to change is the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. And it's not only the Zionist movement, by the way, Jewish socialists as well were very active in Jewish self-defense in response to pogroms. So the Bund wouldn't have ceded to the Zionists the concept of a new Jew. They would also agree that they should fight back, they should defend themselves, that Jews did have power to assert not only their rights in terms of cultural autonomy, but also their physical right to survival. But Zionism in particular had this image of the new Jew as fighting back. And by the way, some of it was very reluctantly agreed to. A lot of Jewish socialists felt really odd about moving to the land of Israel and then not employing the local peasantry. Because what are we doing here? But they wanted to employ Jewish labor because they saw sort of both a cathartic getting out the old Jew and a self-improvement model of Jews working to support Jews and doing the labor themselves on the land. You sort of earn the land by your sweat and your blood. And the phrase that was used at the time was, in Hebrew, livnot et haaretz v'lehibanot ba, which means to build the land and to be built by the land. So your work on the land would really change you and change your connection to the land, to Judaism, and in your own self. What's in it for me, what's in it for you is you'll be stronger, more self-sufficient. But they were very reluctant to create self-defense organizations, for example. In the end, they needed to. And initially, I mean, the word for the Jewish military force that evolved before the state was formed was the Haganah, which literally means the protection force. And Hashomer Hatzair means the young guard. And it wasn't the attack force. It wasn't the conquering army. It was often seen as a defensive force. I mean, over time, of course, the use of military force in ongoing violent conflict produces reaction and counter-reactions. There were a series of pogroms against Jewish presence in Hebron in the 1920s, and then a larger Arab revolt against the British from 1936 to 1939, in which a lot of Jewish institutions and individuals were attacked. And so, again, the attack and the counterattack produces its own dynamic. Certainly after the state was formed, you have, again, the desire to have a more proactive defense strategy, which often includes attacking as well, or the policy that the Ben-Gurion government enacted of substantial reprisal. So if there was a cross-border attack by some kind of terrorist infiltration, then you would attack back, but attack with disproportionate response to try and say, don't do this anymore, we're going to make it cost a lot for you. As we know, the end result of that is simply creating more enemies and people who are willing to attack again. So it's sort of a self-defeating prospect. But as I said earlier, in that split between the labor Zionists and the revisionists tended to be a little bit more hawkish. And they framed it in terms of, and Jabotinsky, if you read some of his material, he actually comes across as reasonable even if I don't agree with the conclusions. And his perspective was, he was writing in the 1930s, he said, look what's happening in Poland, look what's happening in Germany. We need to have Jews come to the land of Israel to save their lives. And yes, I understand it may disadvantage the Arabs who are living there. He acknowledged that. At the same time, he said, their disadvantage compared to our survival, I'm going to make the argument that our survival takes precedence. And so we'll do what we need to do. Now, Jabotinsky was in favor of a maximalist definition of the State of Israel. In fact, when the Palestine Mandate was first formed, it included both Israel proper and what today is the Kingdom of Jordan. And so the original logo for the revisionist movement and some of their more terroristic arms was a greater Israel that was a greater Israel, not just the West Bank and what today is Israel proper, but also the Kingdom of Jordan. In fact, their logo had that picture of the map, and then it had a hand holding a gun, and the slogan was "Rak Kach," only thus. So it was, we need this land, and if we have to fight for it, by golly, we're going to fight for it. And what's interesting about that map is it wasn't the biblically promised land of Israel, it was the mandate for Palestine promised land of Palestine that they were talking about. And because the revisionists were secular too. But they were, again, a more militant response to it. And labor Zionists as well. Once there was a state and there was conflict with Arab armies and Arab irregulars and so on, they did not cry a lot of tears for the refugees who left. They saw, when the state was originally delineated in the League of Nations, the United Nations Partition Plan, it was going to be about 65% Jewish and 35% Arab in its original borders and population. The end result, after all the border shifts to what's today called the Green Line or the Armistice Line in '49, plus all the population moves, both of Arabs leaving and some Jews coming in from Iraq and Yemen, the end result was about 80% Jewish and 20% Arab, or even a little bit less, and that just made it, calling it a Jewish democracy and having it work as a Jewish favoring democracy was just a lot easier when it was 80-20. And so they were resistant to allowing the Palestinian refugees to return. And at the same time, they were absorbing tens of thousands of Jewish refugees coming in from Iraq and Yemen, and the Holocaust survivors coming in from Europe as well. And they were worried about their own as opposed to the others. So that's where this begins. Of course, the history of Israel is a whole other discussion. Again, maybe a topic for a future seminar. Yes, Richard? And then...
sometimes the particular, talking about the Jewish immigrant experience, can be very universal in terms of a great many people resonate with the story of the Jewish people through history. That story resonates for people as far as the American immigrant experience. And one rather striking example of this, upstate, northern New England and upstate New York, where I grew up, is white bread wasp country, and yet people watched the Goldbergs and loved that television show because of the warmth of family and all of these universal kinds of things you find in the particular.
People often point to The Jazz Singer as a great example of that.
There you go.
Because here's a movie, the first talking movie. The Warner Brothers are taking a huge gamble on an unproven technology. There's a reason why we call them movies, by the way, because they were just the moving pictures. Originally, they called talking movies talkies because it was so new. And the question was, why would the Warner Brothers take a gamble on this new technology on a story that is so Jewish about a cantor's son who's supposed to sing Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur? I mean, this is supposed to play in Peoria and all over the country. But what made it resonant was it's the classic dynamic of children and parents, tradition and family, and immigrant culture versus American culture that was applying to Italians and Irish and Lutherans and all kinds of other people who had the same kind of dynamic. It was just in a Jewish key. And that's one of the things we'll talk about later in terms of reasons why to be Jewish and not to just become a universal humanist. Maybe there's something unique about the Jewish experience, or at least distinctive. And maybe there's something that we can universalize from the Jewish experience to a broader context. As I said at my program on Thursday at the University of Minnesota, if there's no distinctive, particular ethnic, human, cultural experience, then that makes life like an Applebee's restaurant, where it's all sort of bland and somewhat Americanized, and it might have had some kind of ethnic origin at one point, but now it's just, made palatable to the broad audience. And I like ethnic cuisine. I like fusion cuisine. I like the distinctiveness of different flavors that you just don't get when everything is universal. We'll talk more about that later.
We make jokes about the country club, But the reality was, a lot of those people who changed their names and tried to deny their Jewish past and identity were discriminated against in government, in the professions, in business, in education, and it's the living memory of a lot of us. I mean, I can remember as a college student, there were some departments in my college, it was clear, no Jewish professors.
Right, that's right.
In terms of, I even remember, being in upstate New York one time as a kid, 5 years old, no Jews or dogs. Sure. Or we would be traveling across country, and as soon as my father would sign the guest book, we don't have any rooms.
Right.
Protective covenants, on and on.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the interesting pieces about Zionism that I read recently by Peter Beinart, who's been writing some interesting stuff on it, he pointed out that one of the generational gaps between older Jews who tend to be more reflexively supportive of Israel and younger Jews who are somewhat more disconnected or questioning of that connection is that experience of anti-Semitism and exclusion, where the argument for Israel as a refuge from persecution has a resonance for older generations who had experiences like that, or worse in Europe and other places, versus younger Jews who have never had that experience of exclusion, limitation, or restriction based on their names or their ethnic or religious identity. And so that argument for Israel as a refuge is harder to make for people for whose experience that is the past. They acknowledge it as history, but it's not their present in the same way. There's a question over here, and I think one over here. Then we're going to actually start.
When you talk about refugees, the Jewish refugees, typically you talk about the Ashkenazi.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been would there have been a shift with the Sephardic population in terms of identity and acceptance?
Well, are you talking about in North America or
in North America, in the U.S., because everything that started in the U.S. that I'm aware of in terms of movies and writing was with the Ashkenazi.
So the Sephardic and Mizrahi or Middle Eastern Jews are a very small proportion of the American Jewish population. They were the founding generation, actually. The first Jews in America were Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. But by even the American Revolution, the Ashkenazi were the majority. In the 1840s, you have a large wave of German-speaking Jews coming from Central Europe that overwhelmed the existing population. And then beginning from 1880 to 1920, you have, again, 10 times as many Jews coming in from Eastern Europe. So if the American Jewish population went from, let's say, 5,000 to 45,000 with the German Jews, the Sephardic Jews are overwhelmed. And then you've got from 200,000 mostly German background Jews, you have 2 million Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews coming in. Even the German Jews are swamped, let alone the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. So while they have an influence in certain urban areas, their numbers are just too small to have a broader impact on the American Jewish community. And I mean, my father is from a Syrian Jewish background. I certainly have sympathy for that population. We have our own Hamisha Jewish food that we don't call Hamisha because we don't speak Yiddish. And it's very different. It's idja and mujadra and what you think of as Middle Eastern food, but for us it's home cooking. But that's a very different dynamic, and it's a minority experience among American Jews. I don't know that if their prominence in the American Jewish community were higher, it would change the dynamic of acceptance. They tend to be somewhat more traditional and insular communities. I mean, nothing like the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews, but the Syrian Jews in Brooklyn, for example, there was a great piece by Zev Chaffetz maybe 10 years ago about this community and how self-interdirected they are. They're assimilated culturally. They shave, they wear modern clothing, and so on. But the community is very restrictive in terms of who you can marry. I mean, you have to get like a special permission to marry an Ashkenazi Jew or a non-Syrian Jew, let alone anyone who's not Jewish, which is totally forbidden. And so these communities tend to not have as much of an impact because they're so interdirected. So I don't know that it would make much of a difference in terms of Americanization. I mean, there are a few examples of Sephardic Jews who've had an impact. You can think of Hank Azaria, for example, the actor. He's from a Sephardic Jewish background. In fact, when he was playing a Latino gay man in the movie The Birdcage, he modeled his dialect on the way his grandmother spoke. Because she came from a Ladino-speaking background coming out of Turkey, and so that was the model for his dialect in that particular movie. But those are episodic. That's not going to change the overall picture. Yes, Margaret?
So I'm 76 years old, and I'm still figuring things out for myself. and, you know, your comments, Richard, and then your follow-up to Richard's comments about the vegetable stew and why even talk about all of this and why the separation. Before you said that, I was thinking about the song Imagine. I mean, and wondering what my life would have been like and how I would have grown up if my parents had told me
You're just a
I was
person.
Lutheran.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been programmed, and maybe we all have just kind of been programmed. We've been told what we are, and therefore we go with it. And develop a real pride in it, and love the traditions of it. But what's it all about, Alfie?
We'll talk a little bit at the end of today's session about why bother being Jewish.
Yeah.
You know, what's the value in it for us? If you could just choose to be human, why not? And sometimes there were people who did that, you know, left behind their Jewishness for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was bad experience, sometimes it was fear. There was a famous case a few years ago, and then we're going to get started in today's topic, of a senator from Virginia. His name was George Allen. His mother was actually a Tunisian Jew, but she had hidden that fact from her family. I mean, her husband knew it, but they never talked about it with the kids. They never did anything Jewish with the family, because during the Holocaust, her father had been arrested by the Germans, had been imprisoned, and the trauma of that had said, I don't want my kids to be at risk ever. I don't want to put a marker on their back. She actually was married to the coach of the Washington Redskins football team, so an all-American family. And when George Allen was running for re-election, it came out during the campaign that his mother was Jewish. And he had this awfully awkward press conference initially where he said, who are you to cast aspersions on people's religion? Like, how dare you say that I'm not a good old boy Christian Virginian and that I actually am a Jew? And then a couple days later, he had another press conference where he said, well, yes, my mother's a Jewish background, but she made really good pork chops. Because he was trying to prove his bona fides as, again, a Republican running in Virginia. He wound up losing that election, actually, to Jim Webb. But it was an interesting dynamic of why had she made that choice, and what was the impact on her children, and what does it mean to rediscover your Jewishness at a later point in life? And actually, Allen has gone on to make a much more positive connection with his Jewishness over time, and that happens too. You think about that show sponsored by Ancestry.com, Who Do You Think You Are? Where they take these celebrities, and they might know one side of the family, but not the other side, or only up to a certain point, and they investigate back and find out what really happened to these people. People love those stories. There's a real curiosity there. People want to know, where did I come from? And so one of the things that I think is a benefit to being Jewish is that you get to know where you come from, and you have a sense of roots. And the question is, can you appreciate the universal from a particular perspective? Or do you need to identify with the universal to not have the risk of chauvinism? Remember that line in the Bund's deliberation? Anything less than pure proletarian activism is going to risk running into chauvinism. And then in the end, they risked running into chauvinism because they saw there was a value in Yiddish language and Jewish cultural identity. But we're always balancing that. And I like to use the example of healthy ego education. I want my children to feel confident and proud of themselves. I don't want them to assume they're the best at everything. You know, they can be good without being chosen or superlative. And I often make the joke that I hate to get cards for Father's Day that say, world's #1 dad. Because I say, you know, what's your data set? How are you evaluating this? Why am I not number 17? I mean, how do you figure this out? I don't mind, you're a great dad. That's fine. They're not objective, but that's fine too. At the same time, you know, the need to be superlative is where we get into the chauvinism, chosenness dynamic. But having a pride in who you are, where you come from, can be healthy as long as it's tempered, as long as there's a reasonable perspective.
And I I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm glad I'm Jewish.
Right.
And I do have that pride. And I,
Remember, for us, there are no forbidden questions.